What's up, everybody? Today I am going to walk you guys through my mastering chain. Um, so this will be mastering one of my tracks that is not one of my best mixes. It's a work in progress. Figured maybe it would bring up more of a situation for me to have to try to fix things that are wrong, which I think could teach you guys more than me just mastering a track that's perfectly ready to be mastered. Um, so let's get a little listen to the track first. That's usually how I would start my process. Just take a little listen, see what's going on. Typically, I might not listen to the whole thing. I'll get like a little taste of the intro, and then get a little taste of each section. So you can see with my mix already that this section is a little quieter than these last two. This last one's the loudest. So my mix could be a little more consistent there. What I always start with is pulling up tonal balance control, taking a look at where it sits in that. So that looks good. Let's check the other sections. So we're all around looking good on tonal balance. So the first plugin in my strip is gain, and that's just so I can either add or take some volume down to get it to the ideal level that I want to process everything at. So that's pretty basic. And then I use DMG equilibrium, and I just have it default to put a high pass filter at 16 hertz just to cut out any subharmonic rumble and stuff like that, and then low pass filter at 16,000 hertz, which is a pretty low curve filter, so that just kind of curtails everything above 16,000 hertz, which I can't even hear above. I've tested my hearing, and it cuts out right about 16,000 for me, but everybody's different. So since tonal balance was in check, this is just what I would leave as my EQ setting, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to put a FabFilter Pro Q before it, and let's just kind of mess things up a little bit, maybe. Alright, now let's see what tonal balance control looks like. So if I see that, I'm gonna look, this is like right around 400 hertz here. So if I got a track that was like this, I'd probably make a little dip, maybe 3 dB there, in equilibrium. Maybe the sub was picking up like a little bit, but usually I'd let that through, but we might just do a slight low shelf. And then the highs were looking a little low, so we can add a high shelf boost. So you can see now those low mids are behaving. I'm going to undo all that. That was just to show you my EQ process if I did get a track that wasn't fitting into tonal balance control. And I highly recommend using this DMG equilibrium, especially for mastering. It's really important that you use a transparent EQ. I won't even touch my masters with FabFilter Pro Q, which is what I mix with all the time. I feel like it's not as transparent for mastering, especially when you're boosting. I feel like this EQ gets really crispy and weird sounding when you boost heavily with it. And it can cause like slight phase issues on the filters. If you just do the pro setup, like the setup wizard, right when you open DMG for the first time and set it to all the highest settings for mastering, I feel like it's probably one of the most transparent EQs I've ever used. So I highly recommend DMG Equilibrium. I'll link that and all these other plugins in the description so you guys can check them out. So that's the first real processing that I'll put on any master. So next, I have Tokyo Dawn Labs Nova, which is another free plugin from them, just like Kotelnikov. This is another EQ that is extremely transparent. I don't like to use it as much as Equilibrium. Usually I'll just use this one because it is also a dynamic EQ. So if I have a range where, say, something sticks up every once in a while, but overall the whole range isn't really sticking up, I would put a band where we need to why isn't it? Oh, I don't have it on. There we go. So let's say I wanted to fix that low mid problem that we had earlier with Nova instead. I'd put a band right here, leave the gain at 0, turn threshold on. So now it's almost working like a compressor, but it's dynamic EQ. So when something does go over the threshold that we set, it's going to push down on it. So let's... So now you can see it's kind of reining in that range, but just as needed instead of pushing everything down. So this is a really transparent and useful tool for mastering too, and mixing. I love to use this one over like FabFilter MB or something. I just feel like it sounds a little more transparent. Although I do have FabFilter MB in my chain too, because I feel like for a little more extreme cases, if I really need to rein something in, Nova can be a bit light. FabFilter MB is a little more heavy-handed. So sometimes I'll resort to that. That's just in there just in case. Usually I'll skip both Nova and FabFilter MB unless they're really needed. On this master, I do not need them. Then I have Tokyo Dawn Labs Slick EQ, which I really just use for their low frequency mono filter because it's very subtle, and really if you look at it through an analyzer, it still lets a little bit of the low frequencies be stereo, but overall, what we would do to check that is I have Isotope Insight up over here, and we can actually, we want to check on the ozone emitter. So we can look here. These are all my analysis plugins just on my master bus, which I have everything sent to. So I'll just go through them all real quick. I have Isotope Emitter, which is going to show us stereo information. And here's what I like to do. I'll solo the subband so we can just see if there's a bunch of stereo information in the sub, then I'll know that I want to do something to counteract that. So when there's a straight line, that means it's mono, and when they're kind of like coming out, that's stereo information. For me, I feel like that's good enough. There was a little bit of stereo information in there, but sometimes I find making your sub mono sounds more obvious than having a little bit of stereo information in your sub. It's not something I worry about too much. So I'll probably still put this on just because I feel like it is really transparent, but this, if we looked at it after this, it's still probably going to show us that there's a little bit of yeah, so there's obviously still a little bit of stereo information getting through, but I think it does help a little bit. So I'll leave that one on. Next plugin I use is the Oxford Inflator. This is basically just kind of making quiet parts louder, kind of boosting things up a little bit. I don't really know how to perfectly explain what an inflator does. I've like settled on these settings for my favorite: 79% of the effect, 0 curb. It is going to just give us a volume boost too. but it kind of brings out the quieter parts more too. It's kind of like bringing everything up a bit. So I love using this. This helps you get a little more volume out of your songs in the end too, which is dope. Um, the next plugin I did not pay my subscription for this month, but I really like it, so I'm gonna try to at least, if it'll let me bring it up even. It might not even show it to me because I didn't pay this month. It's Clariphonic EQ from Kush Audio. I use it in mid-side mode. Basically, what mid-side EQing is the mid channel is everything that's mono in your song, and the side channel is any stereo information, anything that's different between the right and left channel. So what I do with this EQ is add a little high shelf boost of just the side information. So that'll widen the song up just a little bit. I don't use it on every song, but if I feel like a song could use a little width, that's what I use it for. We could, just for the sake of this video, like I said, I never touch my masters with FabFilter Pro Q. Not that I have anything against it. It's like my workhorse EQ in mixing, but in mastering, it's just not quite what I want, transparent wise. So we can put this on mid-side mode. Hold on. Oops. I just messed it up. Okay, so put a high shelf. This is just so you guys could kind of hear what mid-side sounds like. Hold on, I don't really know how to put it. Oh yeah, it's down here. Channel mode, you have to switch from left, right to mid side. So you could just do the left boost or just the right boost, which is another great way to add some stereo, especially in mixing, to add some stereo information. But for mastering, mid side is great because you're just taking up the side total. So here now we have a band that's just on the side. I'm gonna high shelf, just to try to add some width to the highs. So let's bypass it for now. Yeah, so I went extreme there just so you could hear what's going on, but you can see it's not like boosting everything in the highs, it's just that side information. Again, when you use this sort of thing, especially on a master, you want to keep it really subtle. With the Clariphonic, you know, I'm just barely touching it with that. So we're going to take that off for now. That was just kind of to try to explain mid-side EQing a little bit, which I don't really use in mixing a lot. A lot of people do. You can definitely use it in mixing. It's a great tool. I use it on masters all the time if I feel like it needs it, but again, it's not something that you just want to throw on there because you think it's good. It's like you want to use it when you think you need it. So this brings me to Dyne One, the next plugin in my train. One of my absolutely favorite plugins. I need to use it in mixing more. I feel like I could use it a lot. I don't, but I use it on every master that I've done in the last year or so since I got it. Bob Katz recommends it. He's a mastering legend. Basically, it is a multi-band dynamic compressor, but it is also, or a multi-band parallel compressor. So what that means is we have all these bands that are being compressed individually. We have our low frequency, which cuts off at 160 hertz, to the low mid, which cuts off at 800 hertz, which goes to the mid, which cuts off at 4,000 hertz, and then high frequency, which cuts off at 11,000, or high mid, then 11,000, then high frequency. And all these bands are being compressed individually. And then it's parallel because we're going to bring up the volume of the compressed channels right here. Right now, everything's locked together. The threshold's down here. The threshold is locked for all the bands right now, too. So we're going to judge where to put that based on what it looks like when we run it through it. And feel free to ask any questions about this. I know it's kind of more of an interesting concept. So basically the dry signal is coming through full volume, and we're going to mix the compressed signal back in however much dB we're adding right here. But it really brings a track out. It helps brings elements that are in the background up a lot more, and just give your track a lot more beef. So when we do try to limit it down and crush it in the next phase, it's gonna be a lot easier to get volume out of it. So let's see what we're at here. So I think in this case, I'm gonna unlock all the channels, go just to the low frequency, make the threshold a little higher because we're hitting like negative. We're really compressing hard on the sub here. So that's a little bit better, but the low mids too. A lot of times I'll just put Bobcat's tonalization mastering preset on, but then I'll tweak it to the track a little bit. But yeah, give me 1 second. My Soundflower keeps cutting out. All right, so now we're gonna bring the compression back in, or the compressed signal in for the first time. Sorry, once I get this many plugins going, my computer kind of starts slowing down. Alright, I'm seeing now that we're clipping, so I'm gonna reduce the in about 2 dB and the out just to stay safe. Usually 10 dB is about my limit of bringing the compressed signal in, but sometimes I'll go up to like 8, so let's A/B it and hear the difference. So you can see it's a lot more controlled now. The sub's tighter, but I'm kind of worried that in taking the threshold off the sub, I might have in turn turned it down a bit. So let's check that out. No, it's looking fine. It looks like it's just sounding a lot tighter, but I think that's a bit too much. So let's go down to -10. Yeah, it just kind of sounds way looser, more out of control without it, and then with it. Everything's just tighter, flatter. Okay, and then the last step in this section of the chain, I bounce out and then do my second section, because if you can't tell already, my computer is overloading and stopping me every few seconds, so I can't use all the plugins in one chain that I use to master because my CPU cannot handle it. So this is a clipper, and this is kind of a big decision moment for us in, are we going to let this master have more dynamic range, or are we going to try to milk it for all we can get and get the highest LUFS reading we possibly can out of it? So basically, the clipper is going to clip all the peaks of these kicks and snares and make it way easier for the compressor to actually cut into the meat of the track when we get to that section. So the more we clip, the more volume we'll probably be able to get out in the long run in the end. But if we do over 1 dB of clipping, it's probably going to sound pretty noticeable. So let's just experiment with this, see where we're at. So that's like a safe amount of clipping that I would usually do for a more dynamic downtempo master. For the sake of this video, let's try to get as high LUF reading as we can out of this track without distorting it. So I'm going to clip about 1 dB harder than that. Let's see where we're at there. 7.5. Okay, well, if it goes over 1, that always makes me really nervous, and it did, so let's back off a little bit. Yeah, I can kind of hear that clip a little bit too, so let's go to 6.8. That's hitting pretty hard, but like I said, this track is not my best mix, and I haven't really dialed it in fully, so For the purpose of this video, I'm going to let it clip a little bit over 1 dB. We might be able to hear it later. It's tricky, especially at this point, because my computer won't let me play it for more than like 2 seconds. So yeah, that looks okay. So let's bounce this in place, and then we'll go to the next section. This, unfortunately, is kind of the bane of my existence, because especially the plugins that I'm using for mastering are all very high intensive CPU plugins, like DMG, Equilibrium, and Dyne1 alone are using insane amounts of CPU. Like in mixing, usually plugins I use for mixing, I could stack like 15 plugins on one channel and be fine. But because of the plugins specifically that I'm using for this process, TDR Slick EQ uses a lot too, and I'm using a TDR limiter for the clipper. It comes with like 6 pieces. I didn't really explain that one, but I only use the clipper. I'll link that one in the description too. But all these plugins use a lot of CPU, so it takes kind of a while to bounce the tracks out every time. So when I'm mastering, I have a lot of downtime just kind of waiting around for these to render. Which is rather unfortunate. I really hope that technology catches up to what I want to do with it someday, and I don't have to wait so much. But really, in the audio realm, we're a lot luckier than people doing video and digital graphics sort of things. They have to wait days for renders sometimes. That's just ridiculous, but I'm still kind of peeved that I have to have so much waiting time. But yeah, so in the next step, once this is done, basically all we're doing is compressing and limiting, and and maybe add a little bit of color. And we're gonna try to get it up to the LUFS level that we feel is appropriate for the track. And if you don't know what LUFS are, though, that's a unit of measurement that takes into account the way we hear audio. So it's not just a measure of the peak or whatever, it's a measure of the tones combined with the loudness to give us a unit of how loud it is to us from our perception. So it's kind of like a perceived loudness measurement. All right, so this is all nice and clipped now. All those kind of higher peaks are gone. The clipper took care of them. Now it's pretty smooth for the compressor to really be able to cut in. Also, at this point, let's just take a look through a couple different things. I have a bunch of analyzers on here. The main ones I only really use are tonal balance, the emitter to check the stereo of the sub. Sometimes I'll use the other ones just because I like how they look. Like the Fab Filter analyzer is really good for seeing all these little peaks. Isotope Insight's great. We got a nice stereo field on this track. This one looks pretty cool. Sometimes I like to check different meters, but for the most part, it's just tonal balance mainly, and then checking the stereo field. Alright, so next we have Kotelnikov. I've tried a couple of the different mastering presets and tweaked them a little bit. It's kind of all about just getting the ratio and the attack and release right for your specific song. But I found this mastering forward preset is pretty universally, works pretty nice. But by all means, experiment, check things out, you know. Nothing is set in stone. So usually I shoot for just under 2 dB of gain reduction on this compressor. So let's give that a go. I think I can already hear the clipper hitting pretty hard in some areas, but for the purpose of this master, I'm just going to ignore it. So this is the Shadow Hills Mastering Compressor emulation by UAD, which I basically just use as a color box. It kind of just adds a little bit of saturation and color to my songs. I turn the threshold all the way down so it's not actually touching the track with compression, because it's a really slow compressor, and I've found for especially electronic music, it kind of just kills your transients. So I don't actually use it for any compression, but I think it still adds a great color and sound to a track. So I still throw it on most masters that I do. Here's without and with. It's also adding volume, obviously, so it kind of makes it hard to A-B, but I do think it adds some really nice color. All right, and next up is Soothe. I use this on maybe like 10% of masters that I do, and really it's only when the highs are really sharp or there's something resonant sticking out of the mix. I have it set to ear-friendly top on master preset. If you go into the presets, yeah, they have the ear-friendly top on master. And I usually set the wet down to like 70, so it's only 70% of the wet signal. You can see that's taking a lot out of the highs, and you can probably hear it a little bit. I really don't think it sounds good on a track unless it really needs it. So like I said, I only use this on about 10% of masters, only if it's really necessary. On this track, I don't think it is, but it's a very useful plugin, especially in mixing. I use this all the time. If you get a harsh noise or something, throw this on there and it'll soothe it out a lot. Definitely recommend this plugin a lot. So we have it compressed. Now we're gonna start the limiting process. As you can see, I have quite a bit of limiters right here. I have 6. So we're going to start with the first one. Alright, so that's about as hard as I want it to hit the first limiter, just barely, just enough to get it up to level. We were around -12 LUFS. This is a LUFS reading right here. Most of my downtempo stuff I shoot for -10, which by a lot of people's standards is really quiet these days. I don't think loud masters are that incredibly important, but I still do a lot of them for people when they want. I'll get up to like -6 LUFS. Some of my friends I know will push stuff to like -4 LUFS. To me, it just doesn't sound good that loud, but if a client really wants me to, I'll go for it. But at that point, you have to compromise a bit of sub bass, and your mix just has to be super flat and ready to be that loud. If you have a more empty arrangement, or if you have certain things poking out of your mix a little bit, you're not going to be able to get your track that loud without distortion. That's really important. So we've got our first limiter. For this one, I just had set it to the gentle and musical preset in Pro L. No true peak limiting, no oversampling. I think those things generally sound pretty bad, but we'll talk more about that later. So that's our first limiter, and then I use DMG Equilibrium, which is a multi-band limiter, so it's limiting all these bands separately, which kind of gives it a different sound. I like this limiter. I only put 0.9 gain reduction for the second one. So now we're reading at -9.6 LUFS. We're getting loud. Typically, if I was actually just mastering this song for me, I would skip these 2 limiters probably, since we're already that loud. This one is just to catch the peaks, but what I'm going to do is push this one to 0.8 dB gain, and then we're going to put -0 or -1 on the output. So Now everything's peaking at 1 dB, and then we're going to use this final limiter. I'm going to put it to 0, and on this one, we are going to put true peak limiting on. This is what a lot of my friends have been doing to deal with true peaks, because on one hand, true peak limiting sounds kind of horrible and will eat your transients and stuff. But then also, if you have true peaks on your song and it gets converted to MP3, those sound really horrible too. So the middle ground that a lot of my friends have found is going minus 1 dB on your second to last limiter, and then on your last limiter doing no gain reduction, just putting true peak limiting, and then it basically has that whole 1 dB to breathe. But anything that goes over that 1 dB is going to get caught, so you won't have any true peaks on your song. And we can go, this was set to negative 0.3, but let's do 0.1 for the sake of the true peak. So we're around 10 LUFS now. In doing that -1 trick, we lose 1 dB of LUFS too. So now I'm going to add these two limitless limiters. They're each, this one's doing -1.1, the other one's probably -0.8. So only a little bit. And the reason why I stage it out is if you try to do like -6 dB gain reduction with one limiter, it's going to sound a lot worse than if you space it out. The way I like to think about it is your computer's thinking about it 6 times as hard. For every instance of the plugin, your computer's processing that again. Like, so you're asking each limiter to do a little bit instead of asking one to do a bunch, which I find helps a lot in getting that last little push of LUFS out of a track. This definitely isn't the best track I could have picked for getting a really loud master, especially the way the mix is right now. But let's see how far we can push it. Sounding really smashed to me, but we are trying to push it as hard as we can. Like I said, I would be totally satisfied with -10 LUFS usually for my tracks. So I'm going to try to let up a little bit and see where we're at. Alright, my computer is having a hard time playing all this, so I'm going to bounce this out and then we can see where it's at. And I'll show you one more plugin I like to use to kind of compare. So while we're waiting for this, I'll kind of reiterate a little bit some stuff we went over. So, oh, and also I can talk about dithering. So on the last FabFilter Pro L, I did have dither enabled. Dithering basically is kind of adding a inaudible noise to your track that basically when you go down in bitrate from, most of us work in 24-bit, when it inevitably gets down to 16-bit, that will stop certain artifacts from happening because it kind of fills in the space between the bits or something, is my understanding. So dithering is something you want to do and think about if you're going to go down in bitrate, which if you're going to upload to distributing, putting it out to Spotify, to whatever you put online, is usually going to bring it down to 16-bit. So it is something kind of important to think about. I just always have it set on my last FabFilter Pro L to dither for 16 bits. It's not like the most important thing ever, but it's something good to think about. And yeah, true peaks, honestly, if I'm going to be honest, I haven't been doing true peak limiting on any of my masters that I've been releasing of my songs for a while. I think true peak limiting sounds worse than true peaks. I'd rather people just not listen to my music in MP3 anyways, but I know that's not realistic. I know people are. So now I've started to kind of compromise. I think I am going to be doing this -1 dB true peak trick on my tracks from now on. But that's kind of, it could go either way. It's all kind of preference. All right, this should be finishing up here in a second. Come on. All right. So now we have a very fat track. I feel like this is going to sound a little smashed, especially with how the mix was and how heavily I mastered it. But for the purpose of this video, I think it's okay. Let's listen a bit. Yeah, so to me it sounds pretty smashed. I can hear like the highs fluttering a little bit on the sub, which will kind of happen with limiters when you push a little too hard. I can just tell that I pushed it a little too hard. So usually I would go back, let up on everything, just be okay with a little less luffs in order to get a higher quality master. But for the purpose of this video, I kind of want to show you guys the process of trying to push things super hard. Also, obviously, for this track, I probably would have tried to just let the -1 dB trick go, get that extra 1 dB of luffs, and let up on all the limiters, and it probably would have sounded a lot better. But here's this plugin mCompare, which I really like. So here's what we can do. We can load up our pre-master of this track into file 1. Just drag it on in there. And what we're going to do is set ALC, automatic loudness control. And here you can see. So basically what this is going to let us do, we're going to have to turn down our main thing a bit. So what this is going to do is listen to this track, and then we can A and B it with what we did before, but it's automatically going to match the loudness of our master, which is why we have to turn this down, because since this one is more dynamic, it's going to play way louder. So, well, the peaks will be way louder, but perceived loudness is going to be the same. So basically we can hear what we did to it. 1 second here. Okay. Oh, I gotta turn it on. Oops. Wait. We want it to be... Okay. So there it just jumped up to the loudness level it's supposed to be at. And now this is the master. I forgot to press the sync button too, so they play in time with each other. So you're not going to hear a huge difference between this, especially since I didn't touch it with EQ basically at all other than the low and high pass filters. But if you really listen close, you can kind of hear that the elements that were more in the background are up more in the mastered version, and it does sound a little distorted from being smashed so hard, in my opinion. So it's got to reset the auto loudness thing again. Okay, there we go. So it's hard to tell the difference, but it is there. Like I said, if I had touched the master with EQ, like I usually do on most of my clients' tracks, if they're not tonally balanced, it would probably be a big difference that you'd be able to hear. Um, but in this case, it's just louder and smashed. And like I said, there are those subtle differences. So yeah, that's basically my mastering process. I am not very happy with how this master sounds here that we just did. I would never release this, but I feel like it was a good learning tool, and I hope you guys got something out of it. So I think that's all for today. Thanks for listening. Leave some comments, tell me what you think, ask me any questions, and hit me up if you need any mastering done. Uh, Please subscribe if you want to hear more, and thanks.